The world darkened without warning as the howling winds picked up sand and debris, blinding Grace Lawson to everything but her own terror. She had only been traveling for 3 days from Denver to Sacramento to start her new life as a teacher when her stagecoach had been attacked, the driver killed, and the horses spooked into bolting, carrying the vehicle and her fellow passengers away into the gathering storm, while she lay injured on the unforgiving ground. Now, as the dust storm raged around her, Grace wondered if she would die alone in this desolate stretch of Nevada territory. 1874. The wind tore at her clothing and hair as Grace pressed her handkerchief against her mouth and nose, struggling to breathe through the choking dust. Her ankle throbbed where she had twisted it falling from the stagecoach. The bandits who had attacked them had taken her money and most of her possessions, leaving her with only the clothes on her back and the small locket around her neck, her mother's final gift before consumption had taken her 2 years prior. She crawled blindly, seeking any shelter from the punishing storm. Her hands, once soft from years of teaching children in a small Denver schoolhouse, now bled from sharp rocks as she dragged herself across the barren landscape. Her throat burned with thirst, and despair settled over her like the dust that covered every inch of her once fine traveling dress. "Hello," she called, her voice immediately swallowed by the howling wind. "Is anyone there?" But Grace knew it was futile. No one would hear her cries in this maelstrom, and even if they did, who would risk their own life to save a stranger? Miles away, Samuel Zachary squinted against the swirling dust, pulling his bandana higher over his nose and mouth. He shouldn't be out in this weather, no sane man would be, but he had no choice. 2 of his prized horses had broken free during the initial gust of the storm, and he couldn't afford to lose them. At 32, Samuel had spent the last decade building his small ranch outside of Oroville, Nevada territory, through sheer determination and backbreaking work. Every animal was precious, every loss devastating. The wind pushed against him like a physical force as he urged his stallion forward. Thunder, his most reliable mount, was nervous but steady beneath him. Years of riding through rough country had taught Samuel to trust the animal's instincts more than his own at times. When Thunder suddenly changed direction, fighting against Samuel's guidance, the cowboy loosened his grip on the reins. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his words lost in the storm. "You sensing something?" Thunder continued his deliberate path, head lowered against the stinging sand. Samuel's eyes watered as he peered through the brown haze. A shape appeared in the distance too small to be one of his horses. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a human form, a woman crawling on the ground. "Dear God," he muttered, immediately forgetting about his missing horses. He dismounted quickly, stumbling slightly as the wind buffeted him. Approaching the woman, he could see she was in a bad way, covered in dust, clothing torn and clearly injured. Grace looked up at the looming silhouette, unsure if she was hallucinating from thirst and exhaustion. A man materialized from the swirling dust, tall and broad-shouldered, his face mostly hidden by a bandana. Only his eyes were visible, intense blue eyes that assessed her quickly. "Madam, are you hurt?" His voice was deep, steady against the storm's chaos. "My ankle," she managed to rasp through her parched throat. "The stagecoach. Bandits." Without hesitation, the stranger knelt beside her, his strong hands gentle as they examined her swollen ankle. "I need to get you out of this storm. Can you stand?" When she shook her head, he nodded once, decisively. "I'm going to lift you onto my horse. Hold on to me." Before she could respond, he had gathered her in his arms, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. Grace clung to him, feeling the solid strength of his body as he carried her to his horse. The world spun around her, dust and pain, and the unexpected security of a stranger's embrace. "Put your arms around my neck," he instructed as he settled her in front of him on the saddle. "I'll keep you from falling." With one arm securely around her waist, he took the reins with his free hand and turned the horse back in the direction from which he had come. Grace leaned against his chest, too weak and grateful to be concerned about propriety. The steady beat of his heart against her back was the first comforting thing she'd felt since the attack. "My name is Samuel," he said, his mouth close to her ear so she could hear him over the storm. "Samuel Zachary. I have a ranch about 3 miles from here." "Grace Lawson," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for saving my life, Mr. Zachary." "Sam," he corrected. "And we're not out of this storm yet, Miss Lawson." They rode in silence after that, the wind making conversation impossible. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the secure arm around her waist and the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath them. She had no idea how long they rode, but eventually the outline of a building emerged from the dusty haze. Samuel's ranch house was sturdy and well built, with thick walls that muffled the storm's fury once they were inside. He carried Grace through the door, kicking it shut behind them, and gently laid her on a worn but clean sofa near the fireplace. "Let me get this fire going and fetch some water," he said, removing his hat and bandana to reveal a handsome face weathered by sun and wind. His dark hair was streaked with early silver at the temples, and a short beard framed a strong jaw. "Then we'll see to that ankle." Grace watched him move around the room with efficient grace, building up the fire that had burned low during his absence. The warmth began to seep into her chilled body as Samuel disappeared into another room, returning moments later with a basin of water and clean cloths. "I'm afraid I'll have to remove your boot to examine your ankle properly," he said, kneeling beside her. "I'll try to be gentle." Grace nodded, wincing as he carefully eased the boot from her swollen foot. His hands were calloused but remarkably gentle as they cleaned the dust from her skin and probed the injury. "It's a bad sprain, but I don't think it's broken," he pronounced. "I'll wrap it for now, and when the storm passes, I can fetch the doctor from town." "How long do these storms usually last?" Grace asked, accepting the cup of water he offered. "A few hours, sometimes a full day," Samuel replied, efficiently wrapping her ankle with a clean bandage. "This one's especially fierce. We haven't had rain in weeks and the land is dry as tinder." He paused, looking at her more closely. "You mentioned bandits and a stagecoach. Were you traveling alone?" Grace shook her head, her heart heavy as she remembered her fellow passengers. "No, there were 4 others, a married couple, an older gentleman, and the driver. The bandits attacked us about 10 miles back, I think. They shot the driver and the horses panicked. I was thrown from the coach when it hit a large rock. The others—" She swallowed hard. "The stagecoach continued on with them inside, the horses running wild. The bandits took my belongings and left me there, probably assuming I wouldn't survive." Samuel's expression darkened. "The Keller gang has been terrorizing this area for months. The marshal in Oroville has been trying to track them down, but they know the territory too well." He stood, moving to a cabinet where he retrieved a bottle and 2 glasses. "Would you care for a small measure of whiskey? For medicinal purposes," he added with the slightest hint of a smile. "It'll help with the pain." Grace hesitated only briefly before nodding. In Denver, she had been known as a proper, somewhat reserved schoolteacher, but her current circumstances called for practical measures rather than social niceties. The whiskey burned going down but spread a comforting warmth through her body. "Thank you," she said, returning the now empty glass. "Not just for the drink, but for finding me. I don't know how much longer I would have survived out there." Samuel nodded, his expression solemn. "No one should be left to die in a dust storm. I'm only glad thunder sensed you were there." He stood, moving toward what appeared to be a kitchen area. "You must be hungry. I was planning a simple dinner before I realized my horses had escaped. It's nothing fancy, but it's filling." As he busied himself preparing a meal, Grace took the opportunity to look around the ranch house. It was simple but well-maintained, with practical furnishings and a few personal touches, books on a shelf, a guitar in the corner, and a framed daguerreotype on the mantel that she couldn't quite make out from her position. "You live here alone, Mr. Zachary?" she asked, then immediately felt forward for asking such a personal question of a man she'd just met. If Samuel found the question intrusive, he didn't show it. "Sam," he reminded her again. "And yes, it's just me and the horses these days. My father and I built this place together, but he passed on 3 years ago." He returned with 2 bowls of stew and a chunk of bread. "It's not what you're probably used to, but it's hot." "It looks wonderful," Grace assured him, accepting the food gratefully. The stew was simple but delicious, rich with beef and vegetables. She realized how hungry she was and had to remind herself to eat slowly. "Were you born in Nevada?" Samuel shook his head, settling into a chair across from her. "No, I came west from Pennsylvania after the war. Fought for the Union, then decided I'd seen enough of the East. My father followed a year later and we pooled our savings to buy this land." He took a bite of stew, studying her. "And you, Miss Lawson, Denver, you said?" "Yes, I taught at a school there for 5 years after moving from Ohio." She hesitated, then added, "I was traveling to Sacramento to take a position at a new school being established there. They're offering better wages and accommodations than I had in Denver." "A long journey for a woman alone," Samuel observed without judgment. "I wasn't meant to be alone. I paid for protection with the stagecoach company." Grace sighed, the reality of her situation settling in. "Now I have no money, no belongings, and I'm weeks away from Sacramento with no means to get there." "First things first," Samuel said pragmatically. "We get that ankle healed, find out what happened to your fellow passengers, and report the attack to Marshal Collins in Oroville. Then we can figure out your next steps." His calm practicality was reassuring. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but within the solid walls of Samuel's home, Grace felt safe for the first time since the attack. Exhaustion swept over her suddenly, and she stifled a yawn. Samuel noticed immediately. "You should rest. I'll make up the spare bedroom for you." He hesitated. "It was my father's room, but the bedding is clean." "I can't possibly impose," Grace began. "It's no imposition," Samuel cut her off gently. "The storm won't let up until morning at the earliest, and you need to stay off that ankle." His expression softened slightly. "Besides, it'll be nice to have company for a change. The horses are good listeners, but their conversation skills leave something to be desired." The unexpected humor made Grace smile. "Well, when you put it that way, how can I refuse?" Samuel carried her to the small bedroom, setting her gently on the bed before fetching her a nightshirt that had belonged to his father. "It'll be too large, but it's clean and warm," he explained, a hint of color touching his tanned cheeks. "I'll leave you to change. Call if you need anything." Left alone, Grace changed quickly, wincing as she accidentally put weight on her injured ankle. The nightshirt indeed engulfed her, but the worn cotton was soft against her skin. She settled under the covers, listening to Samuel moving about in the main room of the house. Despite the pain in her ankle and the uncertainty of her situation, Grace felt strangely at peace. Perhaps it was simply the contrast between her dire circumstances in the dust storm and the unexpected sanctuary she'd found. But there was something about Samuel Zachary that inspired trust. As the storm raged outside and exhaustion claimed her, her last thought before drifting to sleep was of intense blue eyes and the steady strength of arms that had carried her to safety. Morning brought silence, the blessed absence of howling wind that woke Grace more effectively than any noise could have. Sunlight streamed through a small window, illuminating the simple room where she had spent the night. For a moment she was disoriented, then memories of the previous day rushed back. Her ankle throbbed dully as she carefully sat up. A knock at the door was followed by Samuel's deep voice. "Miss Lawson, are you awake?" "Yes, Mr. Zachary, Sam," she corrected herself. "I'm awake. I've prepared some breakfast, and I've found some clothing that might fit you well enough until we can get to town. My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, passed away last winter, and her son asked me to store some of her things. I hope you don't mind." Grace was touched by his thoughtfulness. "That's very kind. Thank you. I'll leave them outside the door. Take your time. There's water in the basin for washing up." Grace heard his footsteps retreating and then the soft sound of something being placed outside her door. After washing as best she could and combing her fingers through her tangled hair, she opened the door to find a neatly folded bundle of women's clothing. The simple dress was a bit large but serviceable, and she was grateful to change out of the dust-covered clothes she'd been wearing since the attack. Using the wall for support, she hobbled to the main room, where Samuel was setting plates on a small table. He looked up as she entered, his expression warming. "Good morning. You're looking better today, though you shouldn't be walking on that ankle." "It feels better than yesterday," Grace assured him, though it was only partly true. "I can't stay in bed all day." "Stubborn, I see," Samuel commented, but there was a hint of approval in his voice. He crossed the room to offer her his arm. "At least let me help you to the table." Breakfast consisted of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, simple fare but delicious. Samuel ate with the efficiency of a man used to fueling his body for hard work rather than savoring a meal. "I need to check on my horses," he said as they finished eating. "Two are still missing, and I want to make sure the others weren't harmed in the storm. After that, I'll ride into Oroville to fetch the doctor and speak with the marshal about the stagecoach attack." "I'd like to come with you," Grace said quickly. "To town, I mean. I should speak with the marshal myself." Samuel looked skeptical. "Your ankle will hurt whether I'm here or in town," she finished for him. "Please, I need to find out what happened to the others on the stagecoach, and I should send a telegram to Sacramento about my delay." After a moment's consideration, Samuel nodded. "All right, but we'll take the wagon, not ride horseback. It'll be more comfortable for you." He paused, studying her. "Miss Lawson, I should warn you that news may not be good about your fellow passengers if the horses bolted during that storm." Grace swallowed hard. "I understand. But I still need to know." While Samuel tended to his ranch duties, Grace sat on the porch, breathing in the clear air that had replaced yesterday's dust-choked atmosphere. The landscape around Samuel's ranch was rugged but beautiful in its own way, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush, and in the distance, mountains rising majestically against the blue sky. It was different from the lush Ohio countryside where she'd grown up or even the area around Denver, but there was an untamed beauty to it that Grace found herself appreciating. She observed Samuel as he moved among the horses in the corral, checking each one for injuries. He had a way with the animals, speaking to them in low tones and moving with deliberate, non-threatening gestures. Even from a distance, she could see the care he took with each examination, his hands gentle despite their strength. By mid-morning, Samuel had hitched his wagon and helped Grace climb onto the seat. The ride to Oroville would take about an hour, he explained, and the road was rough in places. "I apologize in advance for the discomfort," he said, settling beside her and taking up the reins. But Doc Matthews is the best physician in the territory. He served as an army surgeon during the war, so he's seen just about everything. As they traveled, Grace learned more about the area and about Samuel himself. He had 15 horses on his ranch, breeding and training them for both work and riding. He sold mostly to ranchers and occasionally to the army, though he admitted he was particular about who bought his horses. "I want them treated well," he explained. "I've turned down good money from men I didn't trust to handle a horse properly." "That speaks well of you," Grace said. "Many would simply take the money." Samuel shrugged, looking slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "It's just how my father raised me." A man's character shows in how he treats animals and those weaker than himself. They crested a hill, and Oroville came into view in the valley below. It was a typical frontier town, a main street lined with wooden buildings, side streets with modest homes, and a church steeple rising above it all. Despite its small size, the town appeared prosperous, with several businesses and steady activity visible even from a distance. Oroville was founded just after the first silver strikes in the area, Samuel explained. It's grown some since then, but it's still a small community. Everyone knows everyone else's business, for better or worse. "It looks charming," Grace said, though in truth, her mind was more on the fate of her fellow passengers than on the town's attributes. They drew curious glances as Samuel guided the wagon down the main street. A woman with Samuel Zachary was apparently an unusual sight, judging by the looks and whispers that followed them. Samuel seemed oblivious, or perhaps simply accustomed to ignoring town gossip. Their first stop was the doctor's office, a small building with a shingle reading "Doctor Matthews, physician and surgeon," hanging outside. The doctor, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, examined Grace's ankle thoroughly. "A bad sprain, as you thought, Sam," he pronounced. "No break, fortunately. Keep it wrapped and elevated as much as possible for at least a week. No weight on it for 3 days minimum." He handed Grace a small bottle. "Willow bark tincture for the pain. 2 drops in water, no more than 3 times a day." With her ankle rewrapped and the doctor paid, Samuel insisted, despite Grace's protests, they made their way to the marshal's office. Marshal Collins was a tall, lean man with a weathered face and alert eyes that missed nothing. He listened intently as Grace described the stagecoach attack and her rescue by Samuel. "The Keller gang, most likely," the marshal said when she had finished. "They've hit 3 coaches in the past 2 months. Bastards are getting bolder." He glanced at Samuel. "Pardon my language, Miss Lawson." "What about the other passengers?" Grace asked anxiously. "Has anyone reported finding them or the stagecoach?" The marshal's expression grew solemn. "I'm afraid I have bad news on that front. A rancher found the overturned coach about 15 miles northeast of where you were attacked. The horses were gone, either run off or taken. There were 3 bodies." Grace felt her heart sink. 3. But there should have been 4. The driver, a married couple, and an older gentleman. "The driver and an older couple were found at the scene," Marshal Collins confirmed. "I'm sorry, Miss Lawson. From the description you gave, it sounds like your fellow passengers didn't survive the crash." Grace closed her eyes briefly, grief washing over her for people she had known only briefly during their journey. The Hendersons had been traveling to visit their daughter in California. Mr. Whitaker had been a retired banker heading west for his health. All of them gone. "You mentioned 4 passengers total," the marshal continued gently. "Could the 4th person have walked away from the crash?" "It's possible," Grace admitted. "Mr. Whitaker seemed in reasonable health despite his age." Marshal Collins made a note. "I'll send out word to the surrounding ranches and towns to keep an eye out for him. In the meantime, I'll need a formal statement from you about the bandits. Any details you can remember might help us track them down." For the next hour, Grace recounted everything she could remember about the attack: the number of men, 4 or possibly 5. Their appearance, bandanas covering their faces, but one had a distinctive scar visible above the cloth, and the few words they had spoken. By the time she finished, she was exhausted, the emotional toll of reliving the attack and learning about her fellow passengers' fate weighing heavily on her. Samuel, who had remained a silent, supportive presence throughout, noticed her fatigue. "Is there anything else you need, Marshal?" "Miss Lawson should rest." "That's all for now," Marshal Collins said. "Where will you be staying, Miss Lawson, in case I need to contact you with any news?" Before Grace could respond, Samuel spoke. "She's staying at my ranch until her ankle heals. Doctor's orders." The Marshal's eyebrows rose slightly, but he merely nodded. "Very well. Sam knows where to find me if you remember anything else." Their next stop was the telegraph office, where Grace sent a message to the school board in Sacramento explaining her situation and asking for additional time to arrive. It was a risk they might simply hire someone else, but she had no choice. She couldn't travel in her current condition, and even if she could, she had no money for passage. "We should get some supplies while we're in town," Samuel suggested after she had sent her telegram. "You'll need some proper clothing and personal items." The general store was well stocked, and the proprietor's wife, Mrs. Simmons, was delighted to help Grace select several necessities. Samuel insisted on paying, waving away Grace's protests. "You can repay me when you're settled," he said firmly. "Consider it a loan, not charity." Their final stop was the bank, where Grace was able to arrange for a small amount of emergency funds to be transferred from her account in Denver. It wouldn't be much, but it would allow her to repay Samuel for at least some of his expenses on her behalf. By the time they started the journey back to the ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Grace was quiet, processing all that had happened and the bleak reality of her situation. She was essentially stranded in a strange town with limited funds, an injured ankle, and no immediate prospects for continuing to Sacramento. "You're welcome to stay at my ranch until you're fully recovered," Samuel said, breaking the silence. "I know it's not ideal, a single woman staying with a man she barely knows, but I have a spare room, and you need time to heal before making any decisions about what comes next." Grace glanced at him, touched by his consideration. In normal circumstances, such an arrangement would indeed be scandalous, but these were hardly normal circumstances. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't have many options at the moment, and your kindness has been unexpected." Samuel's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I'm not known for being particularly sociable in town, if that's what you mean, but my mother taught me better than to leave someone in need." "Tell me about your mother," Grace requested, genuinely interested and wanting to shift to a less distressing topic. Samuel was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer, but then he began to speak, his voice softening with memory. "Elizabeth Zachary was a force of nature. My father used to say she could coax flowers from stone and manners from mules." He chuckled. "She was a schoolteacher before she married my father, actually. Taught in a one-room schoolhouse in western Pennsylvania. She insisted on continuing my education even after we moved west, ordering books and making me study while other boys my age were working full-time on their family farms." "She sounds remarkable," Grace said, hearing the affection in his voice. "She was. We lost her to typhoid when I was 16. My father never quite recovered, though he lived another 20 years. Samuel adjusted the reins slightly. "What about your family, Miss Lawson?" "Grace," she corrected, feeling it was time to reciprocate his informality. My parents were farmers in Ohio. Simple, hardworking people who believed education was the path to a better life. They scraped together enough money to send me to a women's college in Cincinnati. My father passed when I was 18, a farming accident. Mother followed 2 years ago, consumption. She touched the locket around her neck. This is all I have left of her. Samuel nodded in understanding. It's hard being the last of your line, makes a person feel untethered sometimes. Exactly, Grace agreed, surprised by his perception. As if you're floating without an anchor. They rode in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The landscape was transformed in the late afternoon light, shadows lengthening and the hills taking on a golden hue. Despite the tragic news about her fellow passengers and the uncertainty of her future, Grace felt an unexpected sense of peace. As they approached the ranch, Samuel suddenly tensed beside her. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice tight. Grace followed his gaze and saw what had alarmed him. The door to the ranch house stood open, and items were scattered across the porch. "Stay here," Samuel instructed, bringing the wagon to a halt. He reached beneath the seat and withdrew a rifle. "What if it's the bandits?" Grace whispered, fear clutching at her heart. "Then I'll deal with them," Samuel said grimly. "But more likely it's just opportunistic thieves who saw I was away from the property." He handed her the reins and jumped down from the wagon, approaching the house cautiously, rifle at the ready. Grace watched anxiously as he disappeared inside, the minutes stretching endlessly until he reappeared in the doorway, his expression hard. "They're gone," he called to her. "But they've made quite a mess." When Samuel had determined it was safe, he helped Grace down from the wagon and into the house. The interior had been thoroughly ransacked, furniture overturned, cupboards emptied, and Samuel's few valuable possessions clearly missing. "My mother's silver," he said, surveying the damage. "And my father's pocket watch." His jaw tightened. Not that there was much worth taking. "I'm so sorry," Grace said, distressed that her presence might have contributed to the situation. "If you hadn't been taking me to town, this isn't your fault," Samuel interrupted firmly. "This has happened before. Remote ranches are easy targets." He began righting the overturned furniture. "At least they didn't harm the horses. That's what matters most." Together, they restored order to the main room, Samuel insisting that Grace sit and direct rather than help physically due to her ankle. As they worked, Grace noticed that despite his calm demeanor, anger simmered beneath the surface. Not just at the invasion of his home, she suspected, but at the reminder of vulnerability. Samuel Zachary struck her as a man who valued self-sufficiency above all else. "There," he said finally, when the worst of the chaos had been addressed. "Not perfect, but livable. I'll check the bedrooms next." To their relief, Grace's room had been largely untouched, though Samuel's had been thoroughly searched, his few personal items strewn about. As night fell, Samuel prepared a simple dinner, both of them too tired for much conversation. "I'll ride back to town tomorrow to report the break-in to Marshal Collins," Samuel said as they finished eating. "Though I doubt he'll be able to do much." "You don't have much faith in the law," Grace observed. Samuel shrugged. "The marshal does what he can, but his jurisdiction is large and he has limited resources. Out here, a man largely has to take care of himself." He collected their plates. "That doesn't mean I won't report it, just that I don't expect results." That night, as Grace lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night, she found herself thinking about the contrasts in Samuel Zachary. He was reserved yet kind, gruff yet gentle, seemingly self-sufficient yet willing to help a stranger in need. He was unlike any man she had known in her relatively sheltered life in Ohio, or her more structured existence in Denver. The next morning, true to his word, Samuel rode to Oroville to report the break-in. He returned mid-afternoon, his expression confirming that, as expected, there was little the marshal could do beyond taking note of the incident and promising to keep an eye out for the stolen items. He did have news about the stagecoach company, though, Samuel said, as he unsaddled his horse. "They're sending a representative to interview you about the attack. Apparently, they're under pressure from their insurance company to investigate all recent robberies thoroughly." "When will they arrive?" Grace asked, looking up from the mending she was doing on one of the dresses Mrs. Simmons had helped her select. "Tomorrow or the next day, according to the marshal." Samuel's eyes fell on her handiwork. "You don't have to do that, you know." "I want to be useful," Grace replied simply. "You've done so much for me, it's the least I can do." A faint smile touched Samuel's lips. "Well, there's certainly no shortage of things that need mending around here. I'm not much with a needle." The next few days fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Grace's ankle improved steadily, allowing her more mobility around the house. She took over the cooking, discovering that while Samuel was competent enough to feed himself, his culinary skills were basic at best. He worked from dawn until dusk, caring for his horses, mending fences, and handling the countless tasks required to maintain the ranch. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in companionable silence. Grace learned that Samuel had fought at Gettysburg and still carried a bullet in his shoulder from that battle. He had a younger brother who had died of typhoid alongside their mother. He loved poetry, but would rather no one knew that particular fact about him. In turn, Grace shared stories of her students in Denver, her dreams of someday opening her own school, and her love of botany, a subject she had studied extensively during her college years. She found Samuel to be an excellent listener, asking thoughtful questions and remembering details she mentioned only in passing. On the fourth day after their trip to town, the stagecoach company representative arrived, a fussy, bespectacled man named Mr. Hollister, who seemed more concerned with paperwork than with Grace's well-being. He interviewed her thoroughly about the attack, making copious notes and asking her to sign a statement. "The company extends its condolences, of course," he said, not sounding particularly sincere. "As for compensation for your lost belongings, I'm afraid company policy only covers items officially registered with the driver before departure, which according to our records, you did not do." "Because I was assured it wasn't necessary for personal luggage," Grace pointed out, remembering the conversation clearly. Mr. Hollister adjusted his spectacles. "Be that as it may, Miss Lawson, without documentation, the company cannot provide compensation. However," he continued, extracting an envelope from his case, "as a gesture of goodwill, we can offer you passage on the next stagecoach to Sacramento, departing Oroville next Tuesday." Grace accepted the ticket, mixed emotions washing over her. On one hand, it solved her immediate problem of how to continue her journey. On the other hand, the thought of boarding another stagecoach so soon after the attack filled her with apprehension. And there was another feeling, one she wasn't quite ready to examine: reluctance to leave the ranch and the quiet companionship she had found with Samuel. After Mr. Hollister departed, Grace sat on the porch, the ticket in her hand, watching Samuel work with a young colt in the corral. There was something mesmerizing about the way he moved with the animal, patient yet firm, establishing boundaries while building trust. The colt, initially skittish, gradually relaxed under Samuel's steady handling. Samuel noticed her watching and waved, a gesture she returned, suddenly conscious of a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. It was a feeling she had experienced increasingly over the past days, a flutter when Samuel entered a room, a lingering awareness of his presence, a desire to make him smile with his rare, genuine smile that transformed his serious face. She was developing feelings for Samuel Zachary, Grace realized, with a mixture of surprise and dismay. Feelings that were entirely inappropriate given their brief acquaintance and her imminent departure. She was leaving in 5 days, returning to the path she had planned for herself long before a dust storm, and a chance rescue had brought her to this ranch and this man. That evening, Grace showed Samuel the ticket, explaining that she would be departing on Tuesday's stagecoach. "That's good news," Samuel said after a moment, his expression unreadable. "You'll be able to take up your position in Sacramento after all." "Yes," Grace agreed, trying to match his matter-of-fact tone. "I've sent another telegram to the school board. With luck, they'll still hold the position for me." Samuel nodded, turning his attention back to the piece of tack he was repairing. "We should celebrate your imminent departure. I could take you to dinner at the hotel in Oroville tomorrow evening if you'd like. It's not fancy, but the food is good, and you've been stuck here on the ranch for days." "That sounds lovely," Grace said, touched by the gesture. "Are you sure it wouldn't be too much trouble?" "No trouble," Samuel assured her, though he didn't look up from his work. "You deserve a proper meal before facing stagecoach food again." The following evening, Grace dressed with particular care in the best of the dresses she had purchased in town, a simple but flattering blue gown that brought out the color of her eyes. She arranged her hair in a more elaborate style than she had bothered with since arriving at the ranch, and even dabbed a little rose water behind her ears, a small luxury she had allowed herself during their shopping trip. When she emerged from her room, Samuel was waiting in the main room, dressed in what was clearly his Sunday best, a clean, well-pressed shirt, a vest, and trousers that, while worn, had been carefully brushed. He had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, and for a moment, Grace was struck by just how handsome he was when he made an effort. Samuel, for his part, seemed equally affected by her appearance. "You look beautiful," he said simply, the directness of the compliment making Grace blush. "Thank you. You clean up nicely yourself," she returned with a small smile. The ride to Oroville was pleasant, the early evening air still warm but with a hint of the coolness to come. They talked easily about inconsequential things, the progress of the colt's training, the wildflowers beginning to bloom in the hills, a book Grace had found on Samuel's shelf and had been reading. The hotel dining room was indeed modest, but clean and well appointed. Several diners looked up as they entered, curious gazes following them to their table. Grace was acutely aware that their appearance together would fuel town gossip, but found she didn't much care. She was leaving in a few days anyway, and Samuel seemed equally unconcerned with others' opinions. Dinner was surprisingly good: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and for dessert, a creditable apple pie. Throughout the meal, Grace found herself studying Samuel surreptitiously, committing to memory the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the deep timbre of his voice, the strength in his hands as he cut his meat. "You're quiet tonight," Samuel observed as they finished their dessert. "Are you worried about the journey ahead?" "A little," Grace admitted. "But mostly I'm just reflecting. It's been an eventful time since the stagecoach attack." Samuel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Life has a way of taking unexpected turns. A week ago, I was just a rancher with some missing horses. Now I'm hosting a school teacher from Denver and having dinner in town, something I haven't done in at least 2 years." "You regret it?" Grace asked, suddenly uncertain. "Taking me in, I mean. It's been an imposition." "Not at all," Samuel said firmly. "In fact, He hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. I've enjoyed your company. The ranch can be a lonely place, especially in the evenings." "I've enjoyed being there," Grace said softly, "more than I expected to." Something passed between them then, a current of unspoken feeling that made Grace's heart beat faster. Samuel held her gaze for a long moment before looking away, signaling to the waiter for the bill. The ride back to the ranch was quieter, each lost in their own thoughts. The moon was nearly full, bathing the landscape in silver light and casting long shadows across the road. As they crested the final hill before the ranch came into view, Samuel suddenly reined in the wagon, bringing it to a stop. "I want to show you something," he said, helping her down from the seat. "It's just a short walk and your ankle seems much better." Curious, Grace allowed him to lead her to a small rise overlooking the ranch. From this vantage point, the view was spectacular, rolling hills stretching to distant mountains. The ranch nestled in a small valley, and above it all, a sky brilliant with stars. "It's beautiful," Grace breathed, tilting her head back to take in the vast expanse of the night sky. "I've never seen so many stars. No city lights to dim them here," Samuel said, standing close beside her. "This is my favorite spot on the whole property. My father and I used to come up here sometimes in the evenings just to look at the stars and talk, or not talk, as the case might be." "Thank you for sharing it with me," Grace said, touched by the personal significance of the place. They stood in silence for a few minutes, absorbing the beauty of the night. When Samuel finally spoke, his voice was low and slightly rough with emotion. "Grace, I know you're leaving in a few days and I have no right to ask this, but—" He turned to face her, his features half illuminated in the moonlight. "Would you consider staying, not just until Tuesday, but longer, perhaps permanently?" Grace's heart leaped, even as her mind raced with practical considerations. "Samuel, I know it's sudden," he interrupted. "We've only known each other a short time, but I've never felt this way about anyone before. When I think of you leaving, of going back to an empty house, it's like thinking about that dust storm rolling back in." He took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "I'm not a wealthy man and ranch life is hard. I can't offer you the comforts or society you might find in Sacramento. But I can promise to care for you, to respect you, and to try every day to make you happy." Grace was overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice and the emotion in his eyes. A week ago, she would have dismissed such a declaration as madness, a proposal from a man she barely knew, offering a life so different from the one she had planned. Yet standing here under the vast Nevada sky, her hands in his, it didn't feel mad at all. It felt like finding something she hadn't known she was searching for. "Samuel," she said softly, "I have feelings for you, two strong feelings that caught me by surprise. But teaching is my calling. It's what I've trained for, what I love." "Oroville has a school," Samuel said quickly. "It's small, and I don't know if they're hiring, but if teaching is your passion, I wouldn't ask you to give that up." Grace was touched by his understanding. "It's not just that. This is all happening so fast. A week ago, we didn't know each other existed. How can we be sure this is real and not just gratitude on my part or loneliness on yours?" Samuel nodded slowly, acknowledging the validity of her concerns. "You're right to be cautious. I'm asking a lot." He released her hands reluctantly. "I won't pressure you. You have until Tuesday to decide, and whatever choice you make, I'll respect it." They returned to the wagon in silence, the mood between them now charged with unspoken emotions and possibilities. Back at the ranch, Samuel bid her good night with formal politeness, though his eyes conveyed feelings far deeper than his words. Alone in her room, Grace paced as much as her healing ankle would allow, her mind churning with conflicting thoughts and emotions. Samuel's proposal had been unexpected but not unwelcome. In the short time she had known him, she had come to admire his quiet strength, his integrity, and the gentle care he showed to both his animals and to her. There was an undeniable connection between them, a sense of understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance. But was it enough to base a life upon? To abandon her plans, her independence, the path she had worked so hard to create for herself? Sacramento offered a position at a prestigious new school, a salary that would allow her to be completely self-sufficient, and the chance to build a reputation in educational circles. Staying with Samuel meant embracing uncertainty, a different kind of life altogether. Grace slept little that night or the next. She and Samuel maintained a careful politeness with each other, neither mentioning his proposal or her pending departure. On Monday morning, with only one day remaining before the stagecoach was due to leave, Grace asked Samuel to take her into town. "I need to confirm my ticket and send a final telegram to Sacramento," she explained, not meeting his eyes. "Of course," Samuel agreed, his voice carefully neutral. "I have some supplies to pick up anyway." The ride to town was quiet, the ease of their earlier conversations replaced by a tension that neither seemed able to break. In Oroville, Samuel left Grace at the telegraph office while he attended to his own errands. Alone, Grace composed her message, her hand hesitating over the paper as she considered her words carefully. When Samuel returned an hour later, Grace was waiting outside the telegraph office, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Is everything arranged for your departure?" he asked, helping her into the wagon. "Actually," Grace said, her heart pounding, "I've made a decision. I sent a telegram declining the position in Sacramento." Samuel stared at her, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "Grace, are you saying?" "I'm saying yes, Samuel," she said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I want to build a life here with you." For a moment, Samuel seemed frozen, as if afraid to believe what he was hearing. Then, heedless of their public location or the curious glances of passers-by, he gathered her in his arms and kissed her a kiss filled with promise, relief, and joy that left Grace breathless. "Are you certain?" he asked when they finally parted. "I don't want you to regret this decision." "I can't promise I won't have moments of doubt," Grace admitted honestly. "This is a very different path than the one I planned, but I've learned that sometimes the unexpected path is the right one. That dust storm brought me here for a reason, Samuel. I believe that now." Samuel's smile was radiant, transforming his usually serious face. "Then let's make it official. Will you marry me, Grace Lawson?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Oroville with Marshall Collins and his wife, Dr. Matthews, and a few of Samuel's neighbors as witnesses. Grace wore a simple cream-colored dress ordered specially from Carson City, and Samuel wore a new suit that made him look somewhat uncomfortable but undeniably handsome. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, both of them speaking their vows with clear voices and unwavering certainty. Afterward, there was a small reception at the hotel, where the same dining room they had visited for dinner now hosted their wedding celebration. "Mrs. Zachary," Samuel murmured as they shared their first dance, the name still new and wonderful on his lips. "Mr. Zachary," Grace returned, smiling up at him. "I believe this is the beginning of a remarkable adventure." "The best kind," Samuel agreed, drawing her closer. "One we'll share together." 3 months later, as summer heat gave way to the first hints of autumn, Grace sat on the porch of the ranch house, their home, watching Samuel work with a new horse in the corral. The ranch had changed subtly but significantly since their marriage. Curtains now hung at the windows. A small garden flourished beside the house, and flowers bloomed in planters Grace had constructed from old barrels. More importantly, Grace had found her place not just in Samuel's home but in the community. The school board in Oroville, upon learning of her qualifications, had offered her a position teaching the older children 3 days a week. The arrangement allowed her to pursue her passion for education, while still having time for the ranch and for building their life together. Samuel, too, had changed. He smiled more readily, laughed more often, and had begun to participate more in town affairs, accompanying Grace to church socials and community meetings. The reserve that had once defined him had softened, though he remained a man of few words among strangers. Their love had deepened with each passing day, growing from the intense spark of their hasty courtship into something richer and more enduring. They learned each other's habits, preferences, strengths, and weaknesses. They had their disagreements. Of course, Grace's insistence on propriety sometimes clashing with Samuel's more pragmatic approach to life. His occasional brooding silence testing her patience, but they worked through each challenge with honesty and respect. As Samuel finished his session with the horse and turned toward the house, Grace felt the same flutter in her heart that had become pleasantly familiar. He saw her watching and waved, a simple gesture that conveyed so much affection, partnership, the shared understanding of two people building a life together. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the hills in gold and crimson, Grace rested her head on Samuel's shoulder. "I have something to tell you," she said, a hint of nervousness in her voice. Samuel turned to look at her, his expression curious. "What is it?" "I saw Dr. Matthews today while you were at the blacksmith's," Grace began. "I've been feeling unwell in the mornings lately, and I wanted his opinion." Samuel straightened, concern immediate in his eyes. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly well," Grace assured him, taking his hand. "In fact, according to the doctor, I'm exactly as I should be. Samuel, we're going to have a baby. In the spring." For a moment, Samuel seemed unable to speak, his eyes wide with surprise. Then, a smile unlike any Grace had seen before spread across his face, a smile of pure, uncomplicated joy. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with wonder. "We're going to be parents." "Yes," Grace confirmed, her own smile matching his. "Are you happy?" In answer, Samuel pulled her gently into his arms and kissed her with such tenderness that tears sprang to her eyes. When he drew back, his own eyes were suspiciously bright. "I didn't think it was possible to be this happy," he admitted, one hand moving to rest protectively over her still flat stomach. "When I found you in that dust storm, I thought I was just doing what any decent man would do. I had no idea I was finding my future, my family." Grace covered his hand with hers. "The storm that seemed like the worst thing to happen to me turned out to be the best," she said softly. "It brought me to you." As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Nevada sky, they remained on the porch, planning and dreaming of the future they would build together, a future born from chance, nurtured by choice, and sustained by love that had blossomed in the aftermath of a storm. 5 years later, the Zachary Ranch was transformed. What had once been a lonely bachelor's utilitarian home was now a thriving family ranch. The house had been expanded to add 2 additional bedrooms, the garden was productive and well tended, and the corral now contained not only Samuel's prized horses, but also a gentle pony for their children. Grace stood at the kitchen window, watching as Samuel lifted their 4-year-old son, Thomas, onto the pony's back. Beside them, their daughter Elizabeth, not quite 2, clapped her hands in delight from the safety of the fence where Samuel had seated her. The scene brought a smile to Grace's face, her strong, capable husband so gentle with their children. passing on his love and knowledge of horses to the next generation. In the years since their hasty marriage, they had weathered challenges together: a severe drought that threatened both crops and livestock, a difficult first childbirth that had left Grace weak for months afterward, the ever-present dangers and hardships of ranch life. But they had also shared immeasurable joys: the birth of their children, the gradual prosperity of the ranch as Samuel's reputation for quality horses spread, and the deep, abiding love that had grown between them, far surpassing the initial attraction that had brought them together. Grace had continued teaching at the Oroville school until Thomas was born, and planned to return part-time when Elizabeth was a bit older. In the meantime, she had started a small lending library in town, collecting books and advocating for education in the growing community. Samuel, once so solitary, had become a respected member of the town council, his practical wisdom and fairness valued by his neighbors. As Grace watched, Samuel looked up and caught her eye through the window. His smile, still rare in public but freely given to her and their children, warmed her heart as it always did. He said something to Thomas, helped him dismount, then lifted Elizabeth from her perch and carried both children toward the house. "Mama," Thomas called as they entered, his face flushed with excitement. "Papa says I can help train the new foal when it's born. He says I have a natural way with horses." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Grace said, ruffling his dark hair so like his father's. "What did you think of your ride today?" As Thomas launched into an enthusiastic account of his adventure, Samuel set Elizabeth down and came to stand beside Grace, slipping an arm around her waist. "He really does have a gift with them," he murmured in her ear, "just like his mother has a gift with words." Grace leaned into his embrace, savoring the moment of connection amidst the happy chaos of family life. "We've built something good here, haven't we?" she asked softly. Samuel's arm tightened around her. "Better than good. Better than anything I could have imagined that day I rode into the dust storm and found you." That evening, after the children were asleep, Grace and Samuel sat on the porch as they often did, watching the stars emerge. It was their ritual, these quiet moments together at the end of the day, a time to talk, to plan, or simply to be together in comfortable silence. "I had a letter from Rebecca today," Grace said, referring to the young woman who had taken over her position at the school. "She asked if I would consider teaching a special course on botany for the older students next spring, just 1 day a week." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "The children would be old enough by then for you to take some time for yourself again. If it's what you want to do, you should accept." Grace smiled, grateful as always for his support of her interests outside their home. "I think I will. I've missed teaching, though I wouldn't trade these years with Thomas and Elizabeth for anything." "They're growing so fast," Samuel said, a hint of wonder still in his voice when he spoke of their children. "Thomas asked me today if he could have his own horse soon, not just rides on Daisy. He's his father's son," Grace laughed, "always wanting to be in the saddle." They fell silent for a time, watching as a shooting star streaked across the sky, a brief, brilliant moment of beauty in the vast darkness. "Make a wish," Grace murmured, a habit from childhood she had never quite abandoned. Samuel turned to look at her, the silver in his hair catching the moonlight. At 41, he was still as handsome as the day he had found her in the dust storm, perhaps more so for the character the years had etched into his face. "I don't need to wish for anything," he said simply. "Everything I could want is right here." Grace reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. "Even after all this time, you still say the most unexpected things, Samuel Zachary." "Only the truth," he returned, raising their joined hands to press a kiss to her knuckles. When I think of how different my life would be if I hadn't gone looking for those horses that day, or if I had taken a different stagecoach, or if the bandits hadn't attacked," Grace continued, understanding his thoughts as she often did. "So many chances had to align for us to find each other." "I used to think it was just luck," Samuel admitted. "Now I'm not so sure. There are too many coincidences, too many moments that had to happen exactly as they did." Grace smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "Whatever brought us together, fate, providence, or simple good fortune, I'm grateful for it every day." Samuel drew her closer, and they sat together watching the stars. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life rich with love, purpose, and the simple joys of family and home. The ranch around them was quiet except for the occasional soft nickering of horses in the stable and the whisper of wind through the sage. It was a peace hard won and deeply valued, a contentment born of shared struggles and triumphs. In the years to come, there would be more challenges and more joys. The ranch would continue to prosper. Their children would grow and forge their own paths, and Grace and Samuel would face the inevitable changes of aging together. But the foundation they had built, a partnership of equals, a love that had deepened with time, and a home created with care and commitment, would sustain them through whatever life brought their way. And sometimes, on clear evenings when the wind stirred the dust on the horizon, they would remember the storm that had brought them together and marvel at how what had seemed like disaster had instead been the beginning of everything good in their lives. As the stars wheeled overhead and the night deepened around them, Samuel and Grace Zachary remained on their porch, hand in hand, not needing words to express what they both knew, that in finding each other, they had found home.